There are not very many American movies about Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, and it isn't hard to see why. You have to be brave to bring this deeply tragic and complex story to the screen. You have to be brave even to watch this movie. The Killing Fields is almost an impossible act to follow, and it stands today as the movie about Cambodia. But did Hollywood really get it right and sidestep all of the huge pitfalls that could so easily ensnare a historical film like this, especially one that came out in 1984? Of course, I'm not Cambodian, and I'm not really a historian, so I'm not going to be diving into the historical details as much as the narrative construction, the themes, and the ideas in this movie. Is this a good historical film? Let's start out with who exactly made the movie. It was the directorial debut of Roland Joffe, who is British. He would direct The Mission 2 years later, which I found a little bit underwhelming. It seems like maybe his career went downhill from the start, but this is a remarkable debut film. The movie was produced by David Putman, who has made a lot of historical films like Chariots of Fire and Midnight Express. I think this is better than both of those. The movie doesn't have a lot of famous faces in it, at least at first, which in serious historical films is usually a good thing. You don't want to travel back in time to Cambodia just to see the latest and hottest Hollywood stars. The main actors in the film are Bill Waterston, who was in the underrated movie Capricorn 1. And I think he actually looks a lot like the character he was portraying, real life New York Times journalist Sidney Schomburg. His associate, Dith Prawn, is played by Dr. Hang S. Ngor. Don't really know how to pronounce his name. This actor, Ngor, was a survivor of the Khmer Rouge, who became only the second amateur to win an Academy Award for acting. Can you name the first one? It's a movie from 1946, I think. John Malkovich is also in this movie. He's a bit more well-known, but I think his casting works. He's kind of a slightly irritable character, I guess. Spalding Gray also had a small part, and he would go on to write a monologue called Swimming to Cambodia about making this movie. Overall, the acting in this movie is great. The casting is great. A last note about the production is that the music for this film was by Mike Oldfield, who did the soundtrack for The Exorcist. The music in this movie is interesting. It's one of the main hints that this film came out in the 1980s, but I think it works. There's also some classical music, opera, in the film, which is maybe slightly on the nose, but again, it works. This movie, like I said, is from 1984, which usually would deter me from watching it, but maybe we can think of it as part of a small movement of historical films in the 1980s. I would include things like Missing and The Year of Living Dangerously in this category. The Year of Living Dangerously is probably the most direct comparison to this movie, although it is quite different. I have a video on it, by the way. None of these movies were directed by Americans. Of course, they all have a somewhat subversive view of the American government, I guess. Perhaps the Vietnam War had opened eyes to a certain type of U.S. imperialism. Maybe we shouldn't be starting off this video talking about the United States, but probably one of the first things you're going to wonder about this movie is whether it's really about Cambodia, whether the story has an inescapable Western tint to it. At first, it really seems like the movie is going to be all about this American journalist, right? He comes on maybe a bit strong. In fact, I think the movie could dial this back 5 to 10% because the film sort of telegraphs the idea that Sydney is going to change. Maybe that builds suspense. It invokes, the film sort of kicks off with a dual character study, a dual character and historical study. You wonder, how is Sydney's psyche going to be crushed, right? He comes in with all this bravado, and you think, well, that's not going to last long. So you wonder, how is his psyche going to be crushed? And you wonder what horrible tragedy is going to crush it. You might wonder, why not just make a movie about Cambodians? Why do we need a white tour guide to make this country seem legible and to make the dangers seem perilous and important? Valid questions. As the movie goes on, my worries about this subsided. I think Cambodia gets its due in this movie. Yes, there's a white perspective, but that might just be one of the points of this movie. One of the big themes in The Killing Fields is the idea of white spectatorship. And just as the U.S. had to face questions about its involvement in Cambodia, Sydney himself, despite being ostensibly a very close friend of Dith Prawn, he has to reckon with how he treated the Cambodians and Dith Prawn in particular. Were they colleagues? Seemingly, but were they equals? Or was there always some feeling that Dith was the assistant, the local, the other? Is there always some kind of hierarchy sneaking into these things. Filmmakers and their audiences are often benevolent towards their subjects, but is there a hierarchy there as well? Do they sometimes endanger them, consume them? The US government, this reporter, film directors, film industry, it's not quite the same situation, but this question of East versus West, hierarchy, spectatorship, is a big part of this movie. I mentioned The Year of Living Dangerously. I like that movie a lot, but it's mainly about Mel Gibson. He finds love with a white woman. He runs around being an action hero. Linda Hunt makes an impression in this movie, but Peter Kwan, is that the name? Is sort of a sacrificial character. Quite different from this movie, where Sidney has no romantic interests. There's no romance in the film really at all, and the story is mostly defined by the relationship between Sidney and Dith, which maybe alludes to the possibility of a true embrace of another culture or between cultures. Not something that's easy, but maybe something that's possible. So, look, Sidney makes a friend. That's great, but what about the 2 million people that were killed by the Khmer Rouge? I think the movie has a good balance between the personal and the historical. Without melodrama or sensationalism, we do get part of the grim picture of the new regime. The Killing Fields came out in 1984 when Cambodia was still in turmoil. Vietnam had taken over the country at that point, I think. But Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were still at large. This movie was filmed in Thailand, and Pol Pot's name is never mentioned. In the movie, we never hear about the infamous prison. I don't know to what extent the scope of the genocide was known in 1984. I think the first time someone from the Khmer Rouge was convicted of a war crime was in 2010. Pol Pot died in 1997 without ever really being prosecuted. The events in this movie basically spanned the 1970s, with the movie coming out in 1984, not too long after that. So things were still fresh, particularly for people like Ngor, who had been in Cambodia just a few years earlier. This freshness, this rawness is unmistakable in this movie, which packs an enormous punch. This is a grim movie, not easy to watch whatsoever, but I don't think it sensationalizes. I don't think it goes over the top. Yeah, it feels very close, in my opinion, to the action, to reality. This movie doesn't bombard the audience with historical facts. We join the action as it's already unfolding without much explanation about what is going on. You'll probably be able to understand the movie pretty easily. There are some footholds, like there are dates on screen now and then. There's a little bit of narration, a little bit of voiceover. There's a little bit of semi-sneaky exposition, but mainly you just kind of infer what's going on. This movie has a lot of unexpected little details, puncta, which is a great thing for historical film. Of course, we come into these movies with some pre-existing ideas about what things were like, and often the things that stick out the most to me are not where that is reaffirmed, but the things that you don't expect, right? Similarly to traveling, although, again, to talk about traveling invokes this hierarchy feeling, this center and periphery thinking or something like that. But anyway, the unexpected is usually meaningful. And there's a lot of that in this movie. For instance, one of the first things we see in Cambodia are some Buddhist monks walking down the street. Well, okay, maybe you should expect that. But later we see some riding on tanks. That's kind of interesting. The reaction to the Khmer Rouge in Phnom Penh when they reach the city is extremely interesting. There's a couple scenes in Phnom Penh, don't know exactly how to say that name of that city, that take place in a warehouse full of Coca-Cola. Some of the soldiers at one point listen to Band on the Run on a little handheld radio. So there's something about the West here. But again, I just like the little details. Of course, there's a motley crew of Westerners at the hotel. They're hanging out at the end of the world. Very similar feeling to The Year of Living Dangerously, where there's also this international hotel. People are tuning into these radio broadcasts, trying to figure out what's going on. It's interesting because the radio broadcasts, in some ways, are their only connection to this outside world, a source of like fact and institution. But on the other hand, the broadcasts often misrepresent what's actually going on. These people are really at ground zero. They understand exactly what's happening in some ways, but they're also completely starved of information. And there's something interesting about what it means to be a reporter here, to have the information at your fingertips, but also be so starved for information at the same time and trying to connect this sort of network. There's a very interesting scene in this movie where they hear a report on the radio about Cambodia, and it's coming from some correspondent who's in Thailand. They're all making fun of him in the embassy. That's interesting. So information flowing quite differently, obviously, in the 1970s than it does now, but still, you see these technological networks of information are absolutely crucial. Okay. Like I said, very similar to the year of living dangerously. All these people hanging out in the hotel, wondering when to leave, wondering what's going to happen next. If you're anxious about getting to the airport on time, this movie will kill you. One question that both of these movies have in them a little bit is like, when is the end? Right? Like I said, they're sitting around trying to wonder, like, what should we do? Tons of uncertainty in this movie. Of course, I love uncertainty in film and in life. There's tons of it. In this movie, nobody knows what's going to happen. This is, I think, one of the hallmarks of history when it is happening, right? When you look back, read the history books, they start with some sort of conclusion or they wrap things up nicely. But when you are witnessing history in front of you, what's the main thing that usually happens? Confusion. People don't know what's going on. Look back at any big event, sort of as it played out in real time. What were the newscasters saying about it as it happened? They didn't know what was going on. Same thing in this movie. Okay, but again, this question of when is the end. A lot of war movies have a decisive finish. We won. We lost. We're doing the airlift. We're leaving. Okay, there is an airlift where a bunch of people leave Cambodia. That comes about, a third of the way into the movie. So a lot of this takes place after the end. And that's some interesting idea. Again, going back to this question of center and periphery, or this question of, these other countries or whatever. Hey, the U.S. pulls out. They say, yep, well, that's that. And yet, life goes on. Life continues. Obviously, things in Cambodia don't stop, right? There's a really interesting feeling once the helicopters have pulled away from this airlift. The characters who remain on the ground, well, they're afraid, but, curious or something. You can just sense the sort of mixed feelings. They're into unknown territory, right? When is the end? Okay. One more thing about the historical angle of the film is that we get almost everything in this movie in the local language. And this is a big check mark for historical films. This is a big plus for me. We also don't really get any subtitles, which is pretty cool. Sometimes Sydney is there, and Dith is translating for him as he tries to talk to some locals, understand what's going on. And you get this sort of back and forth thing, and you understand the sort of operation that this was, the undertaking it is to understand what's going on. You get a very clear sense of some sort of cultural incommensurability or something as you watch them translate back and forth. Of course, there are also scenes that are almost entirely in Cambodian, where Dith is on his own, or there's just some random soldiers or something, and you can more or less assume what is happening in these scenes, but you don't really know. I think this is interesting to think about in contrast to what I was talking about earlier, the dynamic between the East and the West. Most historical films are going to rewrite everything in English, or maybe they'll have some, goofy mechanism to, if not literally translate, to pull you along. Doing this, it really centers Western audiences. In fact, I always think it's kind of funny when there are, there's a movie set in some other country, but everybody's speaking English. Well, do the people who are actually from that country, who, maybe don't speak English, they watch the movie with subtitles? Like, what? This doesn't make any sense. Anyway, that's not going on here. We're not prioritizing the Western audience at all in this movie. In fact, we're kind of bewildering the Western audience by having long sections where you really don't know what's going on. Now, there are a couple of moments where we get to hear an internal monologue. There's a voiceover, right, that helps us through some of these scenes. But this is used pretty sparingly, and often the viewer has to contend with not knowing what is being said. This is not what Hollywood would suggest that you do if you want to make a box office smash. But it goes a long way towards making this movie feel legit. And like I said, it does something important to this question of the relationship between East and West. Okay, there's a couple of other things I want to talk about. This movie features some stark inversions. Inversion is really important in this movie, I think. When the Khmer Rouge take over, certain things that normally become virtuous, that normally would be virtuous, become sinful, right? Certain things that would be good are bad. Inversion. And the movie does a good job of setting this up. One of these things is language. We were just talking about how this movie sort of exposes the language gap. And in the beginning, Dith Pran really earns his keep by translating, right? He can speak English, French, and Khmer. That's the language of Cambodia, not Cambodian. And, since there's no subtitles, the value of these language skills are really conspicuous, right? Turns out they're setting you up because after the Khmer Rouge takes over, they start eliminating just about everyone with an education. If you wear glasses, you are in trouble. If you speak multiple languages, you are in trouble. Dith has to hide his skills at all costs, which makes for an interesting plot line. There's a similar inversion involving adults and children. In the early parts of the movie, we see a few very young soldiers. Most people probably feel sympathy for these kids serving in the army on both sides, right? Well, fast forward to the Khmer Rouge being in charge, and they are trying to distance themselves from the older generation, trying to found some sort of agrarian society. We here, the kids are really prioritized, right? The kids are sort of re-educated. Anybody with ties to previous regimes is, suspect. And to the extent that there are scenes where we have kids surveying the work of the adults, checking their palms to see how hard they've been working, and singling out adults who will be eliminated, right? Like 10-year-old kids or something. Now, you would probably be struck by this, no matter what. But I think the movie does a good job of kind of highlighting the kids earlier in the movie, setting up this sympathy play of like, oh, they're soldiers. Highlights language as well early in the movie, and then it turns it on its head. Now, this kids thing, it's not facile what's going on here. It gives you quite mixed emotions. It's not simply, oh, the kids were, these sympathetic characters in the end, but then they become these mean bullies, right? No, not really. I mean, they are presumably victims throughout. Really interesting. I think this is most of what I have to say about The Killing Fields. Really, this is one of those times where this is just a great movie, more of one to watch than one to analyze. There's a few things about it that maybe could be slightly adjusted, I guess. There's a few moments where the pacing falls off a little. When Sydney returns to the United States, for instance, it's a bit unclear where the movie's going to go. Things do get back on track, but I wasn't totally sure about some of the scenes in there. There's an interesting section where Sydney watches some tape of Nixon on his TV. He's listening to a record and talking about Cambodia, and we get sort of a montage and such. I'm split on this scene. Maybe a bit too much on the nose, but you can see what they're trying to do. For some film people, this might be like one of their major analytical footholds in the movie because it has sort of the most artifice in it. But I would rather pretend like this scene wasn't really in the movie. I don't know. Like I said, you can see what they're trying to do, but it's slightly weird. Again, like I said, I'm not Cambodian. I can't really comment on if this is like an accurate movie, but man, I think one of the reasons why there are no other movies about this time in history is that it is, well, okay, there are, but there are very few, is that it feels almost impossible to follow up The Killing Fields. And I think that this movie does carry the mantle of being the definitive film about the Khmer Rouge. I think it carries that mantle really strongly, and I'd recommend the movie to just about everyone. It is pretty grim, but this is a great historical movie.